Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today's video was inspired by my reading a chapter out of the Answers in Genesis Demolishing Supposed Bible Contradictions Volume 2. I was perusing the book looking for contradictions to address like I did back in December with Volume 1, but once again I was struck by the softball nature of the contradictions. Sure, they take on a few of the bigger ones that are too glaring to omit, like the idea that Adam could have named all of the animals in one day, but they mostly focus on piddly details that aren't really contradictory and that I've never actually heard anyone bring up as a contradiction, like the idea that God is referred to by some 37 titles and names in the Old Testament. So instead of reading through a bunch of their apologetics for why some of these not even a contradiction style contradictions are not really contradictions, I thought I'd discuss something else that jumped out at me while reading. So let's go! What I'd like to discuss here is an issue of framing.
I didn't kill my wife! I don't care!
Not like someone framed me for a murder kind of framing, but the whole concept of framing the context of what the opposition is saying. This is something that we, as humans, just do. I'm telling you a story about something that I heard someone say. I frame the story to try and get across the point that I am trying to make. I might leave out details that I consider to be irrelevant so that you can get the better impression of the situation more efficiently, but the details that I deem irrelevant might not actually be irrelevant to the situation. They are just details that are irrelevant to the impression that I am trying to get across. What struck me here was Bodie Hodge's opening to his chapter dealing with the contradiction in Genesis 22:2, where God says, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love," which apparently contradicts with Genesis 16:11, where it describes Ishmael as being Abraham's first son. Of course, this isn't so much a contradiction as a translation error. In most modern English translations, the Hebrew word yachid is translated as only son, but the word can also be translated as beloved, unique, or special. It was translated by E.A. Spicer for the Anchor Bible as, "Take your son, your beloved one, Isaac, whom you hold so dear." Since Abraham had kicked Ishmael and his mother out some time earlier, referring to Isaac as his beloved son seems a reasonable way to distinguish him from his older brother who was exiled. But that's not what I'm interested in here at all. Like I said, the whole book is full of softballs like this. What I want to talk about is how Bodie introduced the contradiction. Starting on page 35, "I once had a hostile person call me and attack the Bible by saying it was full of contradictions, so I kindly asked him to name one. At that point, he fumbled for an answer for a while. I think he had to find something to reference. Eventually, he said the Bible was in error when Abraham was told to sacrifice his son, because the Bible says it was his only son, Isaac, but that could not be true because of Isaac's older brother, Ishmael. I responded, let's look him up because the way you stated it sounds like a contradiction. It is true that Ishmael was Isaac's older brother, but I would rather see what the Bible actually says. At first, he was offended that I didn't take his word for it. And this is a good lesson in itself. Why trust what someone says God says when we can easily read God's word for ourselves?" So we can see from Bodie's retelling of the situation that the guy who called him about this contradiction was hostile, unprepared, and easily offended. It makes him out to be a bit of a bumbling fool, someone that just has an axe to grind and hasn't even read the passage for himself, taking someone's list of biblical contradictions at face value without checking. This makes it easy for Bodie to paint himself as the person who was able to patiently wait for the caller to fumble through his reference material, calmly suggest that they look at the source material when the caller just wanted Bodie to accept his word for it, and then coolly refute the contradiction, leaving the caller completely unable to answer his refutation with a simple exclamation of, "You Christians are so clever." It's hard to tell from the book whether that is supposed to be a sarcastic sneering, "You Christians are so clever," or an impressed, perhaps on the cusp of converting, "You Christians are so clever." But either way, the caller is just done. We've used the phone call to set the stage of Bodie being the educated, calm investigator who is looking into the claim of a contradiction without bias, willing to admit if he might be wrong, but oh look, the caller wasn't actually familiar with the Bible passage itself, just what someone else had said about the passage. So Bodie is able to shut the whole objection down just by pointing out that the verse qualifies that it's the son whom Abraham loved, not necessarily his only son. Now, sure, I will admit that not all atheists are the cream of the crop. Being an atheist does not make you more intelligent, and being a Christian does not make you less intelligent. So there is certainly a spectrum of abilities and dispositions for atheists, so maybe this phone call did happen exactly as Bodie presented it. But the thing is, in apologetic circles, particularly young Earth ones, the apologists will often frame their arguments around stories of discussions that they had. No video of it, no transcript, no names, just their recollection. And there are a few problems with this. The first and most obvious problem is that we do not have any evidence of these conversations taking place outside of the apologist's telling of the story. These stories are usually presented without names, so there's no way for anyone to verify the validity of these stories. When it is possible to check on the story's validity, it's usually fairly difficult, and then when you do find it, the story didn't end up happening in quite the way the apologist tells it. For instance, when Frank Turek is asked about the moral argument for God, he brings up his debate with Christopher Hitchens and says this.
In fact, I had to say this several times to Christopher Hitchens. Christopher, I'm not saying you're a bad guy. Christopher, I'm not saying you don't know morality. In fact, I like Christopher. I thought he was a good guy. What I'm saying is you can't justify why not murder innocent people to get what you want.
Now, I'm not going to play you that portion of the debate in its entirety, and I will fully admit that I found Hitchens' answer to be somewhat unsatisfying myself, but the point that Hitchens seems to have been going for is not so much a question of how do you know morality, but rather how does the concept of a God writing his morality on our hearts square with the fact that not everybody seems to have morality written on their hearts. Turek asked him how he accounts for the fact that all people have a fixed moral obligation to love and not murder.
There are people to whom those thoughts do not occur, who are deaf to that idea, who only think of themselves, who wouldn't worry about the internal daemon or censor or companion. And there are, of course, people who only get pleasure from being unpleasant to other people and inflicting cruelty on them. The first group we call the sociopathic, and the second group we call the psychopathic. And they occur in nature and in society. My only problem is with those who think that they're all made in the image of God. The one explanation that absolutely doesn't work at all, that gets you nowhere, that explains nothing.
Earlier in that debate, Hitchens had said that morality comes from humanism and is stolen by religion for its own purposes, and this is how it makes sense. Religion, Christianity specifically in this instance, claims that morality is written on all of our hearts. From a secular humanistic perspective, it makes sense that not everybody is going to have the same moral code. Evolution pretty much guarantees that there is variation among the population. But from a Christian perspective, God's morals are supposed to be written on our hearts, so we should all agree on morality even if we choose to ignore morality, and yet we don't. I pointed out in a video response to the World Video Bible School that apologists seem fond of bringing up all the big-ticket items when discussing morality. Obviously, the majority of people agree that rape and murder and slavery are wrong. But when you get into the smaller items that people actually have to deal with every day, people tend to disagree. Is it wrong for me to bring a company pen home from work? That's stealing, so yes. But the company orders extras knowing that some people will take them home. But it's still stealing. But I work for a hotel. They expect guests to take the pens, and they provide us with a virtually unlimited supply because they know people take them, and they consider it an advertising cost. Now, not gonna lie, I have pens from every place that I've ever worked at that provided their employees with their own pens. Sometimes I have taken them home because they were nice pens and I wanted one. Sometimes I just forgot it in a pocket and it just never made its way back to work. But that's not the point of this video. Go watch my other video for some non-pen related examples, which, just as I predicted, did have people both agreeing and disagreeing with my moral decision. So that kind of demonstrates that morality is not innately written on our hearts. Back to the point of this video, Turek presented his discussion with Hitchens as if Hitchens said something incorrect, Turek corrected him on it, and Hitchens was unable to rebut his correction. But when you watch the debate itself and see that conversation taking place, that's not what happened at all. Hitchens was able to, successfully in my opinion, turn the question back on Turek. It's not on the atheist to explain morality, it's on the Christian to explain the differences of opinions of morality. And of course, because I'm not playing you the whole 2-hour debate in which this topic came up numerous times, I might be accused at this point of doing the same thing as Turek. I am framing the interaction in the way that best suits my agenda, with a key difference being that I am providing a link to the debate with the timestamp that I think Turek is talking about. The main bit is about 1 hour and 24 minutes in, if for some reason that timed link doesn't work for you. And there's another trend. I've noticed that, well, I don't want to say atheists, because Ocean Keltoi fits in here, and he's sometimes an apologist, but he also counters a lot of Christian apologetics, so counter-apologists, maybe? So counter-apologists usually seem to try and rely less on anecdotes about their interactions with the various apologists, and more on actually directly responding to an apologist or their arguments. I make videos where I play the video that is making the argument that I am addressing for you, often in its entirety. Paul of Apologia plays the relevant parts of the podcast and videos that he responds to. John of Godless Engineer does the same. And others that, if I keep going with the name dropping, might feel bad for having been left out. And both Paul and John will have direct conversations with apologists when possible. It just seems to be a staple of apologetics, specifically apologetics where the apologist has an interest in convincing people to believe them, is telling a story designed to make people feel like they won't be alone if they agree with the apologist. You're in good company. I once stumped a professor from Berkeley with this argument.
I was on the airplane years ago flying from Dallas to San Francisco, and I happened to sit right next to a professor from Berkeley, UCal Berkeley. He said he believed in evolution. I said, yes, sir, I figured that. You have to teach at Berkeley. I said, tell me, sir, if you believe in evolution, how did the world get here? He said, oh, it came from the Big Bang. I said, really? I'd like to hear about this. He said, you're a science teacher and you have never heard of the Big Bang? I said, oh, yes, sir, I've heard a lot about the Big Bang. And I believe in the Big Bang, but my Big Bang is a lot different than yours. I said, you tell me about your Big Bang, and then I'll tell you about my Big Bang. And so the professor took off on one of those answers that looked like it came straight from the textbook. He said, well, Mr. Hovind, I believe about 18 or 20 billion years ago. That's a long time. All the matter in the universe. That's a lot of stuff. I said, Professor, what happened to your dot? He said, well, Hovind, 20 billion years ago, all the dirt in the solar system was drawn into this little bitty tiny dot, and it was spinning. It spun faster and faster, and all of a sudden, it exploded, Big Bang. And the pieces that flew off became galaxies and sun, moon, stars. And here we are, people, nothing but stardust. I said, sir, can I ask you a couple of questions, please? He said, sure. What do you want to know? We got a 3-hour flight sitting that far away from each other on the airplane. And I said, well, sir, I got a question. You said 20 billion years ago, all the dirt got together for the big squish and the big spin and the Big Bang. Where did all the dirt come from? Who made matter? He said, we don't know that for sure. I said, okay, now, sir, hold it. If I told you that I believe about 6,000 years ago God created the heaven and the earth, then you're going to say, and where did God come from? And I have no idea. But you said 20 billion years ago there was a Big Bang, and you don't know where the dirt came from. So basically, I believe in the beginning God, and you believe in the beginning dirt.
Of course, I am speculating a bit here. I can't actually know for sure the motivations behind this particular aspect of apologetics, but I have yet to see a Christian apologist, when asked point blank about it, say anything other than it is their goal to win souls, to save people from hell, or some variation on that.
And the reason for that is because I love you and I care about where you spend eternity, and Penn Jillette was right when he said, if you believe in hell and you've found everlasting life, how much do you have to hate someone not to share the gospel with them?
And I think that's really the main difference here. As an atheist, I really don't care what you believe. As a polytheist, Ocean Keltoi has assured me that he also doesn't really care what you believe. The reason I make my videos is not to convert Christians to atheism. It's because I would have found videos like mine helpful when I was a young Earth creationist. Yes, I would prefer it if there were less young Earth creationists kicking around, and I would love to convert people away from that, but I just don't care if you keep your religion around. I just don't want to live in a world that's run by people who deny science. Whereas a Christian is told that good Christians go forth and make more Christians out of non-believers. They don't just need accurate arguments, they need them to be emotionally compelling. They need to win souls. Now, if you believe that a belief in evolution is a salvation issue, you now have to make disbelief in evolution sound as comfortable as possible. And what better way to provide comfort for people holding what should be a fringe belief than to tell stories of times when evolutionists were made to look like a fool? Now, it's worth pointing out at this point that even if every single story that the apologist tells happened exactly the way they tell it, that is mostly irrelevant to my point. It certainly would be interesting to interview Hovind's Berkeley professor to see if he remembers the interaction in quite the same way, but he never gets a name, so we can't do that. Same with Bodie's anonymous caller at the beginning of his chapter. But that doesn't matter. My point is that these interactions are being used as framing devices to make you feel more comfortable agreeing with the apologist than disagreeing, because it associates the disagreement with the person in the story who is being cast in the negative light. So, am I saying that these apologists are lying? With a few exceptions, I generally would be of the opinion that they are honestly recalling events to the best of their recollection. The problem is that our recollection, any time it has been studied, has been shown to be rather atrocious. For instance, a study published just in 2019 showed over 3,000 people 6 news stories, 2 of which were completely fake. Half of the study's participants reported remembering the fake events, and a third of those could give specific details that were not included in the original fake report. Studies like this are nothing new. Anyone who is familiar with this sort of research is probably also familiar with the name of Elizabeth Loftus, who has been researching memory since the 1970s and has been an expert witness in trials that have a high component of witness testimony as evidence, like the O.J. Simpson trial, Ted Bundy, the officers in the Rodney King beating, and a couple hundred other cases. There have been studies that have shown that people can have false memories implanted in as little as 3 hours of an interview. And we're not talking something like stealing candy from a store as a child. We're talking about assaulting someone with a weapon. Some 71% of a study's participants developed a false memory of committing that kind of crime. On top of all this, with regards to the development of false memories of things that might be considered worldview issues, you are more likely to develop false memories about something that is perceived as a scandal for the opposing worldview. For instance, if someone called up and challenged your position that the Bible is inerrant, and then you showed that that particular challenge might not have been as airtight as the caller thought, your memory of that event might very well be subconsciously modified over time to be more scandalous for the caller and make you look more favorable. To recall it as such is not necessarily dishonesty on Bodie's part, it's just the way our brains work. It might even be a false memory that was mistakenly implanted by a coworker, in much the same way that police have sometimes been observed to have mistakenly implanted false memories in their suspects. So, is it a dishonest tactic to use? I don't think it's intentionally dishonest, but it is an attempt to give people an emotional reaction in order to convince them, or to make the people who are already convinced feel more comfortable. But that's my point. When you hear someone tell a story like that, don't immediately dismiss it as being untrue. It might be, but even if the story itself is untrue, the person telling it might genuinely believe that it is true. But when you hear the story, consider the motivations behind choosing to tell a story rather than just providing data or evidence. And that goes for everyone. Don't just apply that to apologists and ignore it if someone you agree with does it. If I talk about an interaction that I had with an apologist, ask yourself what emotional reaction am I trying to evoke by telling that story, and why I might be going for emotion rather than evidence. If we're talking about whether or not evolution is true, why does it matter that I spoke to a Berkeley professor on a plane and managed to stump him on a subject that isn't relevant to evolution? The smartest professor, if caught off guard, might not be prepared for a debate with a young Earth creationist. It was on a plane. I don't know about you, but when I fly, I just want to be left alone. It's entirely possible that he was just humoring Hovind for the sake of getting him to shut up so he could go to sleep. Hovind also doesn't say what the professor was a professor of, just that he was a professor from Berkeley. Maybe he was a professor of business administration, Asian studies, English, electrical engineering, film and media. There are lots of things at Berkeley that he could have been a professor of that have nothing to do with evolution. So being able to make him look bad in a conversation about evolution could have been easy. So why is Hovind telling the story? So that he can make it seem like the evolutionist position is clearly the unscientific, uneducated position, so you can feel better for agreeing with him because he managed to show up a Berkeley professor. Berkeley is a fairly prestigious school, and they are well known for having educational materials about evolution, so if you can beat one of their professors on something, then that thing must not hold up to scrutiny very well. So if you start hearing stories like this, chances are the person telling it is trying to get you to feel a certain way. Watch out for that, and ask yourself why they want you to feel something instead of thinking about the evidence. That's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from, well, again, I'm doing a bunch of you. In my video from July 24th, there were two things that a bunch of y'all decided to get nitpicky about. Firstly, I said dragon, and showed pictures of the dragons from Harry Potter and Game of Thrones. But those weren't dragons, they were wyverns, because they only had 2 legs. And I referred to the dragon on the city seal that he brought up as a basilisk, when it was clearly a cockatrice. Okay, so to address them both. Firstly, if you look up wyvern, you will learn that a wyvern is a type of dragon. So all wyverns are dragons, but not all dragons are wyverns, meaning that my usage of dragon was correct there. As to the basilisk, it is a similar, though less clear-cut thing here. Sometimes the word basilisk and cockatrice were synonymous. In fact, if you go to the Wikipedia page for basilisk, you will see the very picture discussed in that video as an example of a basilisk, with the caption stating that it was the Archangel Michael killing a basilisk. But all of that aside, let's remember what we're talking about here. This is not Dungeons & Dragons, where a wyvern is officially a cousin of the dragons and so not the same thing, or that a cockatrice is a completely different beast from a basilisk. We're talking about ancient myths and legends, which were spread by word of mouth before the printing press became a thing. There was no canon where, canonically, this is a dragon, but this is not. A wyvern, basilisk, and cockatrice could all be considered dragons, and depending on which region you were in, a cockatrice and a basilisk were the same thing. In D&D, it is necessary to distinguish between the different types of dragons and monsters because, you need to know what you're up against and what kind of strategies to prepare for, but in pre-printing press times, there was no concept of copyright or monster canon. The stories would change and evolve as they traveled, making these distinguishing lines hard to draw at times. All that to say, don't apply the D&D monster manual to ancient legends. It likely won't match up perfectly. And no, it doesn't have to be D&D, that's just the example that makes it the most obvious. Wherever your favorite modern mythology canon definitions come from, it likely makes these distinctions more clear than they would have been to the cultures that created the myths to begin with. Thanks for watching. Special thanks as always to my patrons, especially David Schinkel, Lynn Dobbs, Mark McManus, and What Jesus, who are the subjects who make the storytelling of my channel possible. If you'd like to be a potential figment of my false memory, you can support the channel for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino. Other ways to support the channel, such as direct donation or my Amazon wishlist, are linked in the description, as well as my social media accounts and my P.O. Box address. See you next time!